If you paid attention in history class, you'll know the name Iwo Jima. Famously, the Japanese island played host to the Battle of Iwo Jima, a devastating conflict that proved to be a turning point in World War II. But decades on, an earthquake near the island brought up something incredible. Long-buried evidence of the iconic battleground has returned to the surface, and it's wowed historians and war enthusiasts alike. An earthquake unveiled the lost resting place of a priceless World War II relic. The Battle of Iwo Jima was one of the most ferocious encounters of World War II, with more than 6,000 Marines and around 18,000 Japanese troops losing their lives. But it wasn't just the bloodshed that earned this island a place in history. There's also a volcano there that could erupt at practically any moment. And it's this kind of volatile geography that brought up those astonishing relics. That volcano is Mount Suribachi, and it's arguably one of the most dangerous of its kind in all of Japan. It's no wonder the island remains uninhabited apart from a few members of the Japanese military. And the danger posed by Suribachi could be far more imminent than people realize. At least 10 volcanic eruptions have occurred on Iwo Jima, with the latest happening in 1982. But while you may think it's now safe to travel there, don't be fooled. There's an ever-expanding area of discolored sea around the island that suggests volcanic activity. And that led Satsuya Nakata of the University of Tokyo's Volcano Research Center to make the chilling revelation: there is a possibility of a big eruption on Iwo Jima. That could be devastating. But just because Mount Suribachi continues to slumber, that doesn't mean there can't be volcanic activity in other parts of the region. And in 2021, photographs emerged of an eruption that happened not too far from the Iwo Jima coastline. It came from the underwater Fukutoku Akinoba volcano, located 3 miles north of Iwo Jima. And little did historians realize that this would set off a fateful chain of events, one that would uncover some priceless World War II artifacts. While volcanic eruptions are not uncommon in Japan, this one was certainly more memorable than most. After all, it helped to create a new island nearby. But the surprises definitely didn't stop there. As a result of the eruption-induced tremors, some relics from the Battle of Iwo Jima rose all the way up to the ocean surface. Hidden on the ocean floor for decades, these mysterious items were finally ready to show themselves once again. Captured through satellite imagery, 24 transport ships that were used during the iconic World War II battle had emerged. Believed to have been captured by US forces in the final days of the conflict, these vessels have quite a remarkable backstory. Of course, the ships carrying soldiers and weapons to the battlefield are essential to any war. But as military experts now know, these transport vessels played a different yet equally vital role in the Battle of Iwo Jima. In fact, you could argue that they were part of the reason why the US invasion was a success. Following the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, Japan tightened its control over Southeast Asia and the Pacific. This posed a great threat to the United States, which, along with the rest of the Allied powers, was desperately struggling to win World War II. But the US wouldn't give in. Soon, it would launch a massive counteroffensive on land, by air, and by sea. As the US took its fight to the Pacific, the military set its sight on capturing territories with strategic advantages. One of them was Iwo Jima. The island was home to 2 airfields, both of which could provide the Americans with a launchpad for an invasion of Japan. So, on February 19, 1945, the US made its big move. The US swiftly began its ground operation of Iwo Jima, deploying Marines onto the island's beaches. But while they were able to gradually advance towards their goal of capturing the airfields, the Marines struggled on the island's rugged terrain. Not only was it covered in steep dunes, but the beaches were also made up of volcanic ash. Worse still, the Japanese had a plan up their sleeves. As the Americans advanced, the lack of response from the Japanese convinced them they were winning. Little did they know, however, that this was all part of the enemy's plan to wait them out. At dusk, the Japanese launched a banzai charge. Dozens of soldiers attacked the Marines, creating a mounting list of devastating casualties. While the US was rocked by the resilience shown by the Japanese, it pushed forward, eventually capturing one of the targeted airfields. By this stage, both the American and Japanese forces had been heavily depleted. And left with no other option, the US deployed a further 70,000 Marines to the island, a move that it hoped would shift the momentum in its favor. Despite losing the battle, the Japanese remained determined to fight until the last man, launching one last banzai attack with 300 troops. The Americans defeated them, too, although they were ironically unable to claim victory until 4 years after the end of World War II. That's because Japanese forces refused to surrender, and so Iwo Jima was never used as a staging area as intended. But how did those ships factor into the battle and its aftermath? Well, these ghost ships, which were sunk on the western part of the island, were captured and used by the Americans to form what was called a breakwater. Typically walls of stone or wood, breakwaters protect harbors from waves that would otherwise damage boats or the people and items on board. This is precisely how the Americans managed to begin their ground assault. And as the American troops pushed on, the effectiveness of Japan's strong defensive tactics began to wane. The Japanese were running low on weapons and food, allowing the Marines to gain the upper hand. In a most iconic moment, US troops captured Mount Suribachi, raising the stars and stripes in triumph and solidifying the image in the American consciousness for all time. But the fighting wasn't over yet. The Americans decided that, as a means of protecting their soldiers and supplies from potential Japanese ambushes, they would organize these boats in a formation that would shield the vessels unloading troops and weapons. It just goes to show how resourceful the US military really was, particularly when it came to taking on the Japanese in their own territory. And thanks to the Fukutoku Okanoba volcano, experts now have a more comprehensive understanding of the vessels that played a vital role in the Battle of Iwo Jima. Unfortunately, though, most researchers aren't lucky enough to have this kind of help when attempting to unearth long-lost World War II ships. That's why in 2019, Tim Taylor and his team set out to uncover the mysterious and tragic fate of a US submarine and her crew. The sub the researchers were searching for is the USS Grayback. Or, as it was less lyrically known, the SS-208. This salvage operation was carried out on behalf of the Lost 52 project, which is dedicated to locating the 52 US submarines that disappeared in World War II. That's right. The US Navy had posted the Grayback as missing in late March 1944, over 75 years ago. And little is known about the sub's mysterious disappearance. Here are the facts. On January 28, 1944, the Grayback embarked on a combat patrol from Pearl Harbor. It was her 10th mission and, as it happens, it would be her final one. The sub sent a message back to base on February 24, reporting that she'd sunk the Japanese freighters Toshin Maru and Taikei Maru and hit 2 others. But that wasn't the last anybody heard from her. The sub made another report on February 25. Her crew said the craft had done serious damage to the liner Osama Maru, a Japanese troop carrier, and sunk the tanker Nampo Maru. But these attacks over 2 days had left the Grayback with just 2 torpedoes. So she had to set sail to Midway Atoll in the North Pacific for resupply. Yet the craft never arrived. That February 25 radio message was the last anyone heard from the Grayback. Navy commanders had anticipated that the submarine would dock at Midway Atoll on March 7, 1944, but there was no sign of her on that date. Even more alarmingly, the Grayback still hadn't appeared 3 weeks later. So the authorities had no choice but to declare her and her crew of 80 as lost at sea. They did this on March 30th. Still the question remained. What had happened to the Grayback? Dozens of men had seemingly perished, leaving their devastated loved ones looking for answers. But there was simply no trace of the submarine that had proved to be a huge asset to the US Navy. And make no mistake about it, the Grayback and her crew had played their part in many World War II battles. That's perhaps not surprising when you consider the craft was built at the legendary Groton, Connecticut's Electric Boat Company. The skilled Electric Boat Company workers had been building submarines since 1899. In fact, they had built the US Navy's very first submarine, the USS Holland. And at the time of World War I, Electric Boat Company and associated shipyards built 85 submarines, among other craft, for both the US Navy and the British Royal Navy. Then, during World War II, Electric Boat created another 74 submarines including the Grayback. The Grayback was a Tamber-class vessel, of which 12 were built. 7 examples were then destroyed during the war, and Tamber submarines were ultimately taken out of combat service in 1945. The Grayback, of course, was one of those subs that never made it to the end of the conflict. The size of the Grayback makes this pretty improbable, too. When she was finally completed, she was a little over 300 feet from stem to stern and displaced 2,410 tons when submerged. At her widest point, she measured just over 27 feet, while her maximum surface speed was around 20 knots. Underwater, she could travel at just under 9 knots. At a lower speed, the sub could also stay submerged for up to 48 hours, and her range was nearly over 12,500 miles. So it would take a lot to bring her down. It was powerful, too. The Grayback's 2 propellers were driven by 4 electric motors, charged by a quartet of diesel engines. Her official crew strength was 54 enlisted men and 6 officers. But as we know, she had 80 men aboard when she disappeared in 1944. And that's not all. The Grayback was well equipped, with 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 set towards the bow and 4 at the stern. Further armament came in the form of a 50 caliber machine gun and Bofors 40mm and Ehrlichen 20mm cannons. These weapons were intended as defense against assault from the air, although they could also be used in attacks on enemy shipping when the sub was surfaced. But they couldn't prevent the craft's ultimate fate. Some 10 months after the Electric Boat Company had started her construction, the Grayback was launched on January 31, 1941, by Rear Admiral Wilson Brown's wife. The submarine was commissioned into the U.S. Navy on June 30, only 5 months or so before America became embroiled in World War II. And things started well enough. After her commissioning, the Grayback embarked on her shakedown cruise under the command of Lieutenant Willard A. Saunders on Long Island Sound. This was an opportunity to test out the submarine's systems and to allow the crew to familiarize themselves with the vessel. And with the sub standing up to the task, she finally went on patrol to Chesapeake Bay and the Caribbean in September 1941. Then Pearl Harbor happened. After further maintenance at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard on the Maine coast, the Grayback headed for Pearl Harbor in February 1942, as the U.S. was decidedly now a part of the conflict. And things were about to get serious for the boat and her crew. On February 15th, the submarine set off on her first wartime patrol. She sailed into the Pacific and cruised along the coasts of the island of Guam, which Japan had attacked in December 1941. The Grayback also traveled in proximity to the coast of Saipan, which at that time was similarly Japanese territory. And during this patrol, which lasted 3 weeks, the boat spent 4 days in a cat-and-mouse game with a Japanese submarine. The skirmish saw the enemy unleash 2 torpedoes at the Grayback, and while she emerged unscathed from this assault, she was unable to maneuver into position to return fire. After escaping the attentions of the Japanese sub, though, Grayback succeeded in sinking her first ship, a cargo vessel of 3,291 tons. By contrast, the Grayback's second patrol was a relatively uneventful affair that ended when she docked at Fremantle. This Western Australian port would be her base for most of the rest of her time in service. The Grayback's next 2 patrols in the South China Sea were blighted by Axis patrol boats, moonlit nights and seas that were difficult to navigate. Nevertheless, she managed to hit an enemy sub and some merchant ships during these spells in the ocean. Then her 5th tour of duty began on December 7, 1942, when she set off from Australia. On Christmas Day 1942, the Grayback surfaced, catching 4 landing barges unaware and proceeding to sink them all. Then, 4 days later, an enemy sub fired torpedoes at the American craft, although the Grayback's crew took successful evasive action. The start of 1943 was similarly eventful, as the U.S. sub attacked the Imperial Japanese Navy vessel I-18. And while the I-18 ultimately escaped undamaged this time around, the destroyer USS Fletcher sank the Japanese boat with depth charges the following month. All her 102 crewmen perished as a consequence. During this 5th tour, moreover, the Grayback carried out a daring rescue operation. 6 Americans who had been aboard a wrecked Martin B-26 Marauder bomber were stranded at Munda Bay on the Solomon Islands. 2 of the submarine's men went ashore after dark and found the airmen, while the Grayback went on to dive at dawn to escape the attentions of Japanese planes. Then, the following night, the 2 submariners successfully ferried the 6 survivors back to the Grayback. The boat's captain, Commander Edward C. Stephan, who had succeeded Saunders in September 1942, won the Navy Cross for this action, along with a U.S. Army Silver Star. Continuing on her mission, the submarine later torpedoed several Japanese craft, although she was ultimately damaged herself by depth charges dropped from an enemy destroyer. The weapons had damaged a hatch on the Grayback's hull, and the resulting leakage forced her to return to port in Brisbane, Australia. And, unfortunately, the submarine's next patrol in February 1943 saw no successful attacks owing in part to a newly fitted but malfunctioning radar. In any case, the Grayback managed to survive to her 7th tour, which began from Brisbane on April 25, 1943. On this cruise, the Grayback came across a Japanese convoy and hit the merchant ship Yotagawa Maru with 2 torpedoes, sinking her. Then, a few days later, the U.S. vessel torpedoed an enemy destroyer, causing extensive damage. Nor was that the last of the American victories. The following day, the Grayback sank yet another cargo ship, the England Maru, and hit 2 more. Following these triumphs, then, it was time to sail back to Pearl Harbor and on to San Francisco, California, for a refit. On September 12, 1943, the Grayback was back at Pearl Harbor and ready for another Pacific mission, her 8th of the war, with Commander John Anderson Moore now in charge of the boat. And so 2 weeks after returning to Pearl Harbor, the submarine set off for Midway Atoll alongside the USS Shad. At Midway Atoll, the Grayback and the Shad were joined by the USS Zero, with the 3 vessels constituting what was known as a wolf pack. This approach of combining submarines as joint attack forces had proved highly successful when used by German U-boats, although it was the first time that the U.S. Navy had tried the tactic. The new stratagem proved to be effective, however. Between them, the 3 subs accounted for the sinking of 38,000 tons of Japanese shipping and damage to a further 3,300 tons. Having used up all their torpedoes, the trio then turned back to Midway Atoll, arriving there on November 10, 1943. And after the success of this mission, Moore became the 2nd of the Grayback skippers to win a Navy Cross. Then, on December 2, 1943, the Grayback set off again from Pearl Harbor for the East China Sea. During this 9th patrol, the submarine fired the entirety of her torpedo supply in 5 days of attacks, sinking 4 Japanese ships in the process, before returning once again to Pearl Harbor. Commander Moore's exploits on that tour earned him another Navy Cross. Finally, after stopping off in Pearl Harbor for just over 3 weeks, the Grayback set sail for her 10th and, as it turned out, her last active service mission on January 28, 1944. And as we learned earlier, her last radio contact with base came on February 25. After that, nothing more was ever heard from the submarine, leading the Navy to duly declare her lost on March 30. On that final mission, the Grayback had single-handedly sunk a staggering 21,594 tons of Japanese shipping craft. It had been the 3rd such trip she'd sailed on with Moore at the helm, and the commander was posthumously handed a 3rd Navy Cross for his achievements at sea. The Grayback herself was also ultimately awarded 8 battle stars for her World War II service. It would be many decades, though, before anyone found out exactly what had happened to the Grayback and her 80-strong crew. Initially, the U.S. Navy believed that she had sunk beneath the waves at around 100 miles to the southeast of the Japanese island of Okinawa. Yet as it was later discovered, this assumption was based on data that included a crucial error. The information that the Navy had relied upon, you see, came from records that had been kept by the Japanese. As it turned out, though, a single digit in a map reference had been wrongly transcribed when the relevant document was being translated. Consequently, the Grayback was actually far from the location that had been assumed over the years. And it wasn't until 2018, when American Tim Taylor decided to re-examine the case of the Grayback's disappearance, that the mystery was untangled. Taylor is the founder of the Lost 52 Project, a private enterprise working to find the remains of the 52 submarines that disappeared without trace during World War II. We'll come back shortly to the results of Taylor's reinvestigation of the Grayback mystery, but first we'll focus on him and his organization. The Lost 52 Project started after a successful search for the U.S. submarine R-12, which had been lost in 1943, along with 42 of her crew. Also known as the SS-89, the vessel sank during a training exercise off the coast of Florida. Launched in 1919, the USS R-12 was something of a veteran, as she had actually been decommissioned from the U.S. Navy in 1932 and assigned to the reserve fleet. With war threatening, however, the Navy brought her back into service in July 1940. The R-12 then sailed to Naval Submarine Base New London at Groton, Connecticut, where she underwent a comprehensive overhaul. So, in October 1940 the R-12 was ready for active duty, with her first mission being to patrol the waters around the Panama Canal. A year later, the Navy ordered the submarine to return to New London, from where she cruised along the shores of New England. And after the Pearl Harbor attack in December 1941, the R-12 returned to the Panama Canal, where she spent the following 10 months. After nearly a year in Panama, the R-12 then went on various cruises until May 1943, when she was reassigned as a training submarine based at Key West, Florida. The following month, however, she was sailing on an exercise when a forward section of the vessel began to take on water. And in mere seconds, the submarine was overwhelmed, leading her to sink to a depth of 600 feet. As the R-12 began to plunge below the waves, 5 of her crew who had been above deck on the conning tower, including skipper Lieutenant Commander E. Shelby, were thrown overboard into the sea. They were the only survivors of the catastrophic sinking, as the remaining 42 crew members all lost their lives. The cause of the accident was never fully explained, and the wreck remained undiscovered for nearly 7 decades. But in fall 2010, Taylor and his crew aboard research vessel Tiburon discovered the remains of the R-12 using a high-tech remotely controlled robot. The team also went on to revisit the area on further expeditions, mapping the site and taking images of the wreck. In addition, they made every effort to contact surviving relatives of the submariners who had died in the accident. And it was that successful hunt for the wreck of the R-12 that prompted Taylor to found the Lost 52 Project. The organization takes its name from the fact that 52 submarines were sunk without a trace during World War II. These tragedies had an extremely high human cost, too, with 3,505 submariners perishing in total. All in all, then, the Lost 52 Project aims to discover the location of all of the U.S. Navy submarines sunk during the war. It's a tall order, but over the past decade Taylor and his crews have come across 5 submarines whose precise whereabouts were previously unknown. And their mission goes much further than that, too. In particular, Taylor wants to both uncover the fates of these sunken subs for posterity and, crucially, to give family members of the lost seamen some closure. And along with locating the craft, Lost 52 works to create comprehensive surveys of the wreckage found, collects artifacts and makes material available for educational purposes. What's more, the Lost 52 Project has discovered 2 other World War II submarines alongside the R-12 and the Grayback. The USS Grayback was found off the coast of Alaska, while the USS 28 was located in Hawaiian waters. A Cold War era vessel, the USS Stickleback, was similarly found off Hawaii. Altogether, then, Taylor and his team's efforts have been rewarded by notable successes. Now we'll get back to Taylor's work on finding the Grayback. On the search for the sub, the ocean explorer got in touch with Japanese researcher Yutaka Iwasaki and asked him to comb through the files of the Sasebo base that had been used by the Japanese Imperial Navy during World War II. The records there included daily radio updates from Naha on Okinawa Island, which had been the site of a Japanese naval air facility. So, Iwasaki duly got to work, upon which he spotted the crucial single-digit error. This mistake had been made in the transcribed version of a report that had been radioed into Sasebo from Naha on February 27, 1944, just a couple of days after the Grayback had reported back to base for the last time. And the relevant Japanese message detailed an attack by a Nakajima B-5N bomber that had taken off from an aircraft carrier. The Nakajima B-5N was a Japanese torpedo bomber, and this particular example, flying on February 27, had apparently discharged a 500-pound bomb onto a submarine traveling above the waves. The report also described how the device had hit the sub just to the rear of the conning tower. Then, after that, the vessel had blown up and quickly sunk with no apparent survivors. And while speaking to the New York Times in November 2019, Iwasaki described what he had found in the Japanese wartime files. In that radio record, there are a longitude and a latitude of the attack, very clearly, he explained. Astonishingly, though, these coordinates marked a location that was more than 100 miles distant from the one the US Navy had assumed to be correct since 1949. So, armed with this new accurate information, Taylor felt that there was now a realistic chance of locating the wreck of the Grayback. And, amazingly, the Lost 52 project team did indeed find the lost submarine, whose hull was almost entirely in one piece, even after several decades had passed. Yet this discovery was a cause for mixed emotions among the divers and researchers. Speaking to the New York Times, Taylor recalled the feelings of the Lost 52 team. "We were elated. But it's also sobering because we just found 80 men," he said. And, of course, there were others for whom this discovery was a momentous event. They were the relatives of the submariners who had lost their lives aboard the Grayback. One of the people greatly affected by the news that the Grayback's remains had been discovered was Gloria Herney, whose uncle Raymond Parks had served aboard the submarine as an electrician's mate, first class. In November 2019, she told ABC News, "There's a book I read, and it says these ships are known only to God. But now we know where the Grayback is." Herney also spoke to CNN that same month, telling a reporter, "The discovery brings closure to the questions that surrounded the Grayback as far as its sinking and location. I believe it will allow healing as relatives of crew members come together to share their stories." Herney added that upon first hearing about the discovery, she had felt shock and grief. But later on, the news had brought peace and comfort. Kathy Taylor is another relative of one of those who lost their lives aboard the Grayback, as John Patrick King, who served as an electrician's mate, third class, had been both her uncle and godfather. And while speaking to ABC News, she paid touching tribute to the late veteran, saying, "I committed from the very beginning, from a little girl, that I was gonna find him or follow him or keep his memory alive, whatever I could do." Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.